Chasing Giants with Don Higgins and Terry Peer. Brought to you by Osseo Camo, nature's most lethal camouflage. Follow along as Don and Terry discuss the techniques, strategies, and dedication needed to harvest one of God's most amazing creations, world-class whitetails.
Well, welcome everyone to the Chasing Giants podcast, episode 271. And this podcast is going to air on May 4th. Don, one of the biggest topics we're going to talk about this week is the cold or cool, wet spring and how it's affecting a lot of different things. It's odd because some areas are dry, some areas are wet, but we're going to talk about that later. Other than that, what have you been up to? And let's talk a little bit about the activities there in Illinois.
Well, there hasn't been too much activity because of the rain and cool temperatures, really. But I'm kind of sitting in the middle of this zone where south of me is really wet and north of me is dry. And actually, I was up by Prairie about 3 weeks ago, and Prairie is 2 hours north of me, and they were planting corn pretty hot and heavy the day I was up there, up around Bloomington as well. But south of me, there's basically been nothing planted whatsoever. Around me, I would say less than 5% of the ag fields have been planted, so almost nothing. I have, for the first time ever, here it is May, and I have not even planted the first seed in a food plot, and that's never happened before that I can remember. So kind of worried about how this start to the antler growing season is going to, play out, because I like the fact that we've got moisture. We've got plenty of moisture. We got a lot of good green vegetation. My clover plots look fantastic. Winter wheat fields and my deadly dozen plots from last fall have really greened up. And so the deer have had good nutrition. I'm not worried about that at all, but these cold, damp days, so many of them in a row, I've got to think that that's having a little bit of a negative impact. If we'd have had the moisture that we got, but we'd have had temperatures about 10 degrees hotter than we've had, I'd feel a whole lot better about it.
It's interesting how, like you said, geographically, it's just a tale of two different stories. I'm really curious, our listeners are from such a diverse area. Kind of comment down below if you're listening on YouTube what your area is like, because I know that out in western Kansas, they're completely dry, almost drought conditions, and I'm a little bit different. I think we've dried out, but here just in the last couple of days, we've had rain. I was out of town all week, but we put a video out on Chasing Giants TV. I planted fruit trees right after Al and Joe left from turkey hunting last week, and rain came in, but the ground was perfect to work and plant up until then. If they weren't here turkey hunting, I would have been planting all week. But I think it's just really interesting how such a short distance apart can be such a big tale of everything. I don't know what all the areas up in Ohio is like, or down in Missouri. We got a lot of listeners in different places. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Just comment down below if you want to chip in and give what the report is in your area. As far as planting, Don, planting, what products, what's the percentage and divvy up of what you got planned for the property this year? I don't know that we've talked about that this year.
Well, for me, it's going to be all grains. And the reason for it is I've acquired a little more farmland around my farm, and the greens that I provide are going to be as cover crop on some ag fields. So all my food plots are going to be in grains, either corn or soybeans, and probably at least probably just one will be in a new real world grain sorghum mix. But I'm probably going to have 50 acres of cover crop, and I'm going to be putting together a custom cover crop mix through Green Prairie Seed Company. There's going to be a 50-acre green food plot on my farm this year instead of some little ones.
Yeah, we've been testing a lot of this stuff I know I did a test on triticale last year, but with us having Green Prairie now as another tool in the toolbox, if you will, it's just going to provide us with so many different cover crop, no-till, and regenerative farming solutions for everybody that we're going to be testing and showcasing and video documenting for everybody this year. So I'm really excited about that. You and I are going to do even some more testing on some products this year that's going to take up some acres of our farm, aren't we?
Oh yeah.
So I just got
Yeah.
that.
So
I got that seed in here. Austin brought it back with him. We got nutritional products that are going to be tested on your Ohio properties. And here we got a full gamut of projects that we're getting data points back for possible future products with either Green Prairie or Real World.
yeah, the testing never ends. We're always trying to get better because if there's something else better out there, we want to be planting it on our own farms. And I think that's the thing that sets Real World apart from these other companies is that we're trying to make our number one priority is making our own properties the very best that they can be. And then a kind of a result of that is that once we find these things that we think are the best, we're marketing through our companies. Yep. So if there's something better out there, we want to know it because we want to be using it.
Yeah. We get the request all the time for people to say, let me test, but people have to understand that the control group of the first phases of testing that we're doing right now is kept extremely small and confidential. When we start getting it out to where we want people from different areas to get a hold of it, that's what we then consider a pilot program. Or, like we have friends that will say for instance, the hidden access product that we've been private labeling for years, we'll ask people, say, to do a specific test. We want you to plant it on this date, and we want you to plant another section of screen at this date, just to show the different planting dates and what the difference is for standability or something like that. But I appreciate the willingness of people to help, but the phase that we're in with some of these products right now, it's in a very, very small confidential test group.
Well, and also the amount of seed that we have to start with is usually very limited. For example, you and I are testing a couple things that we got one bag of. And so you and I had to split the bag of that product to plant on our two farms. And that's the only two places it's going to be planted this year. Dwayne gave me a couple of clovers that he had acquired new clovers to test. So in the new fruit orchard that I was featured on the Chasing Giants TV video, that plot is actually in the test clovers, but there was a limited amount of that too. So a lot of times we're starting out with one bag of seed and maybe 1 acre's worth. So we just don't have the seed to send out to everybody that wants to test. Now, if it pans out, then, we make an effort to acquire a lot more the following year.
Yep. But it's interesting now that we have Chasing Giants TV and we're releasing, usually at least 2 videos a week, sometimes 3. Stuff that we're willing to talk about that we're not holding proprietary. I think there's a lot more data points for those that are watching it out there. You just filmed a video and sent it in today. I believe, what was that, about rope scrapes or something like that? I haven't watched it yet, but with the B-roll that you sent. So there's a lot of extra information that kind of complements what we talk about on here if people are watching the Chasing Giants YouTube channel. And let's just talk about that for a minute. Basically what we're using is this platform to put a lot of different information out. So I think it's important for people not to be confused. We're going to maintain Sunday release date for this podcast as best we can. There's going to be flyers where we end up having to do late releases or something like that. But for the most times, it's going to be releasing at 8 o'clock Eastern on Sunday morning. But then through the week, you're going to see different videos and different things posted. Right now on Tuesdays and Thursdays, there's habitat work videos that are being done. And then eventually here in June, around Father's Day, the Chasing Assurance podcast is going to air in the middle of the week. So just know that there's a lot of different things that are going on. We want to keep it all on one central platform. When you started this original YouTube back years ago, we would have never thought that we would have this many different things that we would be able to showcase and use the YouTube channel for.
Yeah, and it's people got to realize that the podcast, it's on YouTube, but it's on all these other different platforms as well. So I would say probably less than 25% of the views or
Less than
the uploads,
10.
downloads,
Less than 10.
less than 10% are actually happening on YouTube. And all these other platforms, people are listening to them in their trucks driving down the road or whatever. Maybe their earbuds while they're working or whatever. So, but with the videos are YouTube only. So for you guys that are not watching the podcast on YouTube, you may want to check out our YouTube channel for some of these videos, because like Terry said, there's multiple videos every week. And the one I filmed today, I was out hanging a rope scrape because it's too muddy for me to be planting plots or a lot of the other habitat projects that I want to do. But this is the time of the year to be hanging those rope scrapes. And I did a couple of things at this rope scrape that I don't think were on the original video, because on our channel there's a video from a few years back that I did on rope scrapes, but I did some things today on this one that I don't think were on that original video. So that's just one. We're putting out 2 or 3 a week, like you said. So if you guys are just listening to this podcast and not watching on YouTube, you may want to check out the YouTube channel, Chasing Giants with Higgins Outdoors, I think.
And we have quite a few listeners that just like to tune in to tell us everything we're doing wrong. That's always
absolutely.
That's always a good thing. It's a good opportunity for those of you who are sitting in your mother's basement that don't have anything better to do, that just want to surf the internet and tell everybody what they do wrong. We have a perfect platform that you can go and watch. It helps our analytics when you just leave a bunch of comments below that are rude and hateful and tell us that we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, because neither one of us has ever accomplished anything in life. We're just a couple scumbags, and we can use all the help we can get.
Sarcasm at its best, folks. You got to laugh a little bit at life. When we put ourselves out there, we know it's coming back at us, but we're trying to get better at laughing at it. At least we're sarcastic now instead of whining about it.
Yeah.
So like some people said,
and we still offer that 100% money back refund if somebody's not happy.
Yeah, when we have a technical difficulty with Aaron on the podcast last night, and I'm trying to edit the podcast at 3:30 in the morning, and the audio sucks, and I want to go to bed. I know all you paid subscribers are losing money by the bad audio. So, no, in all seriousness, we did have a pretty bad problem last week. So, trying to get the audio stuff fixed. We know it's annoying, but we actually got some stuff on order that'll hopefully help continue to improve those two rednecks that are not very good at technology, trying to get better every week. Your feedback is important, even though we're making fun of it right now. Let's take a quick break and we'll be back. And I want to talk, Don, we talked about antler growth. Let's spend this cool, wet spring, and let's talk more about planting dates a little bit with the products that we mentioned, and make a couple announcements, especially as consulting season's wrapping up. So we'll be right back.
Osseo Gear introduces a premium line of bow hunting gear that is unmatched, pairing nature's finest camouflage with the best technological innovations. Osseo Gear brings whitetail bow hunters the gear they need to be the best at their craft. The unique camouflage mimics the intricate feather pattern of North America's greatest predatory creatures. Designed for invisibility, built for comfort, and engineered for function. Visit OsseoGear.com. That's ASIO Gear.com to start shopping. Osseo Gear. Prepare to be invisible.
Well, before we get too far into the podcast, last week's episode with Dr. Aaron Gaines, I really enjoyed that. I really hope people go back and watch the mineral video that he did on Chasing Giants TV, because there's one thing about Aaron. He used to work for Real World, or with Real World. We purchased the rights to Expect Healthy Deer Technology. He went to work for Analogics. Analogics got sold to Pradco, and he's kind of on the free market, so he does some consultant work for us. But the thing I appreciate most about Aaron is he's never going to come and promote one company. He's kind of like Dr. Strickland like that. He promotes the science and talks about the science of something, and if that aligns with the company that has that, so be it. But he's just such a great guy, and we really appreciate him taking the time to help us last week. I hope a lot of people go back and listen to that podcast, or go back and listen to the mineral video where he talked about the need for micro and macronutrients, and he's the real deal, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He's an asset and has been from the very beginning when he was working with Real World and introduced us to his Expect Healthy Deer technology. And just one of those guys with a whole lot of integrity.
Yeah.
That he's not going to steer anybody wrong. He's not in it for the wrong reasons. He's not in it to make a name for himself or to make money. He's just doing something he enjoys. He makes his living on the livestock side of things, and he just loves whitetails and land management for whitetails, so that's why he's involved.
Yep. Well, we have a lot of good questions, so let's burn through this segment a little bit. We have talked for the last couple weeks about the makeup event at JBs Feed. So why don't you talk about that real quick so we make sure we leave enough time to get through these questions tonight.
Yeah, so I'll be at JB's Feed at Millersburg, Ohio on Tuesday, June 3rd. Kind of a makeup event for the one I missed last winter. The only time I've ever been scheduled to appear somewhere and didn't make it. Terry filled in with our good buddy Ray Miller and did a fantastic job. But there was nearly 1,000 people showed up for that event, and I feel like I let them down. So I feel like I'm obligated to go back, and we're going to do that on June 3rd. The speech, I'm not really going to call it a seminar. It's really not a speech either. I'll call it a sermon. the talk I was going to give, I have never given before, and I've been saving it for this area for a special reason, and I'll get into that night. But it starts at 5:30. After the event, there'll be a question and answer session. I'm not sure if Terry will be there or not. Hopefully he will, but if not, I'll be there to answer questions. But Tuesday, June 3rd, Millersburg, Ohio. If you're going to attend, you should probably call JB's Feed there in Millersburg, but I don't have the... Oh, there it is. The phone number's down at the bottom there. 330-893-3684. Give them a call and let them know you plan to attend that event so they can plan accordingly.
Yep. And I got news this week that I need to make a run to Kansas City. Guess what just arrived at Chris Yates's place?
Well, I'm guessing you got a new truck.
Yep. So our color rotation, so people can't keep track of who we are and where we're parked at when we're hunting, has continued. So all new color that we try to be on the down low whenever we're doing. No, I actually went back to black this time. So going to be good to go out and see Chris hopefully this week and trade out my truck from Victory GMC. So looking forward to that. Let's see. You've just finished up consulting. I have one follow-up visit tomorrow morning on a project that was logged. I got that last project done in western Kentucky that was swampland that's been underwater. I want to tell you what, the amount of water that came up in that area with these two storms was insane, Don. We were down in this bottom, and it's swampy ground anyway, but I'm looking at the mud line on the trees from where the water was up, and I mean, it was high, and you're looking at these huge bottoms. Water is such a crazy powerful thing and what it can do when it gets out of control. But super great property. Met a new friend, got an absolute ton of ticks on me, got bit a bunch, had to go back on antibiotics again. Man, these things are just driving me bonkers.
Well, I hope you don't get that alpha gal disease.
All right, so what follow-ups or anything from consulting season do you have? Any closing comments from the season?
Yeah, I did the last property just a couple days ago. It was here halfway local, about 45 minutes or an hour from my house, and kind of a last minute for a former client that I've looked at. I guess this would have been the third property for them, but yeah, I think next week or at some point we need to, you and I, talk about the top 2 or 3 properties that we've seen each and what we liked about them. But one thing I want to throw out to all the clients, that I've had this year is that, I always send out the written plan by mail. It's printed out in our spiral bound notebook and such. But I also try to always send a digital plan by email to everyone, and sometimes I get on the road and I get busy, and I always remember to send out the printed out plan, but sometimes I forget to send the digital. So if anybody's listening and you did not get a digital plan and you want one, just give me a holler. And the other thing is, my phone, I just can't keep up with it, during consulting season like I should. So if you ever called me and you're a client and I didn't get back with you, please accept my apologies and reach out again, because I want to make darn sure everybody gets taken care of the best I possibly can. So just want to throw those two things out, and I don't know, maybe next week or the week after, Terry and I can talk about the top properties that we've seen, and
I
I
think
got
that'd be
two
fun.
in mind. Yeah, I've got two in mind.
I know the two, right? I know the two. One of them's a small one, a tiny one, and one of them's a big one. I could
Yeah.
do it right now, but yeah, I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Maybe we can even ask permission from the landowner if we block out location, if we could put a vague aerial up just to show a little bit of it. We'll see if that's okay with the landowners. I don't know, that might not be, but we'll check into it for those wondering.
Probably not going to be okay for my two, because I think that they would stand out. Anybody in the area would know these properties, because there's just some unique things about them, which I'll talk about next week.
I think the small property, I could do it in a way that you would not be able to tell anything, because it's in hill country, so it looks just like, from the aerial, it looks like every other part in a 6-county radius. But we'll see what we can do to graphically display why we think it's different. I think that gives another element to those watching when we can kind of be a little bit more visual of it. So we'll see what we can do on that. But that'll be fun.
Yep. Well, we'll plan on that next week.
Yeah, so as consulting season winds down, we're actually going to have a meeting with all of the consultants that work for you to try to figure out how we can better serve everyone, kind of up our game with our plans and materials that we provide. So that's going to be combined with a real world dealer event. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so any real world dealers that are listening, on June 26th and 27th, we're going to have our second dealer event. Had one last year, so this will be the 2025 version. Be in Arthur, Illinois. Penn Station is a facility there in Arthur. It's going to be a different facility than we used last time, because being in the summertime, we wanted to make sure there was air conditioning. And the facility we used previously does not have air, so we're trying to think of every angle to make you comfortable. We're going to feed you for a couple days and have some entertainment and some education. And you can also pick up your fall order, save some shipping costs at the same time. So we're going to be sending a letter out about that, but go ahead and mark your calendars for June 26th and 27th. And then that's a Thursday and a Friday. And then the next day, on Saturday, the 28th, all of our consultants are going to have a meeting. There's 7 of us in all. We're going to start with some classroom, basically on the screen, showing some different properties and things. And we just want to make sure that we're providing the best service that we can for our clients. And then we're going to actually go, after lunch, go out into the field and look at some things on my farm, some ideas that I want to make sure that everybody that we're working with is aware of, and just different ways things can be done to improve a property. For when we show up, we want to do 2 things. We want to make that property grow the biggest bucks that can be grown there, and then we want to make sure that the client his property is set up in such a way that he can kill those bucks.
Yeah.
So we got to grow them, and we got to kill them, and we want to do the best that we can at both those things. So I think this meeting is going to be good for everybody as we discuss a number of topics.
Yep, absolutely. So let's transition to the Higgins Hot Seat question, and this is brought to us by 360 Blinds. I talked to Mark and Merle this week, and they were giving me some feedback about the new Chasing Assurance podcast. They are obviously a faith-based company, so having some feedback from them and what they see. Every 360 Blind is actually shipped with a little book about the book of John in the New Testament. Mark is very passionate about sharing the good news of Jesus with his business. I wanted some feedback from him, so it's so nice to have some friends in the business to give you some guidance when you ask for it. But Make sure you visit 360huntingblinds.com, especially to check out the new Chasing Giants blind. Limited production, and they're almost gone for the year, so make sure you check that out. But Don, our question for today goes back to that theme of the early and wet spring. And it becomes an issue where we have it every year. People want to know how early and how late they can plant because of weather. So walk us through specifically corn, soybeans, and sorghum. What are our plant dates for? Where do we judge when and how late we can plant if you're in an area that's either wet or dry? How much time do we have?
Well, I mean, the corn is probably the most critical of those three because you need those heating degree days to mature that corn crop. So I would like to have my corn in, before the 1st of May. We're more dependent on the weather now than we are the date on the calendar. So just as soon as the ground conditions are ready now, you should be planting your corn, pretty much no matter where you're located at. Soybeans, a little more forgiving. You can plant them a little later. You can go into early June. I prefer to plant mine by mid-May, and in past years, early May. But it's not going to happen this year. So I'm hoping by mid-May I've got my corn and soybeans planted. The grain sorghum is one that gives us a lot more leeway. I've seen grain sorghum planted here in Illinois on a commercial basis, on a commercial farm, as a double crop after wheat. Grain sorghum does not require the moisture. It'll do better in a drier environment than either soybeans or corn. So you can move a little bit later into the summer. Now, with that said, ideally, I would not want to. You can double crop soybeans after wheat as well, but you're not going to get near the crop. So I'd want to get that grain sorghum in, by the end of May, if at all possible.
So we still have plenty of time. No use everybody panicking. It's what do we say?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody. Which way do you always say it? In the spring, they either wait too late or too early.
Late.
They plant too late.
Plant too late in the spring and too early in the fall.
Too early in the fall. So hopefully with this ground moisture either lacking or an abundance of, that we can get that regulated and everybody can get their crops in. We'll kind of circle back maybe in the next couple weeks about post-emergent herbicides and what's available. But, the residual stuff that we have available, you and I are doing some different post-emergent stuff. So we're going to be talking about that and maybe doing some video.
You threw me a curveball on this hot seat question because last week you said that there was a newspaper article from 1987, and I've spent a week thinking about newspaper articles from 1987.
Well, you're going to have to think another week because the reason for it is I had to go plan B because I didn't have it on a slide on the computer. The picture of it is still on my phone, so I wasn't able to get it onto the screen to where it was legible for everybody to see. So yeah, you got to wait. We got to wait one more week.
Is there a picture with this article?
That's why I wanted to wait. I wanted to have an actual picture so everybody could see the article, but it just wasn't clear enough for me to. On the phone, it's okay, but when somebody looks at it on YouTube and it's bigger, it's going to be too distorted. So I want a better picture of it. So we had to delay it 1 week. But I held it. I held the actual newspaper in my hand and read the article. So.
Wow. It was under the police reports. Was it a mugshot or?
Not going there. Depending on the year, it could have even been in the, the classifieds where it had the old dating app. You looking for a date for Friday or Saturday night. So it might have even been there. You never know. Were you and Robin married by that then?
80s.
See, you never know. You could have been young Don Higgins on the prowl.
We were dating, though. We started dating in 1986. So.
Okay. Well, hopefully we won't get you in trouble with the missus.
I don't think I was ever on one of those newspaper pages or whatever you're talking about.
All right, well, let's throw the first question of the week up on the screen and get started there.
Don't risk your most valuable asset with a part-time agent. Most real estate agents are part-time, working another job, trying to scratch together a few extra bucks in real estate as a side gig. Their inexperience will cost you thousands at closing. Not at Midwest Land Group. They only hire full-time professionals. Their agents are passionate about the outdoors, highly trained, and committed to maximizing the value of your land. If you're interested in selling your land, don't risk it with a part-time agent. Visit MidwestLandGroup.com.
All right, this one comes from Chase Nicely from Blaine, Tennessee. It says, Don, this question is in regards to your recent Facebook post and podcast pertaining to genetics, nutrition, and age. If genetics is the answer, and we do as much as we possibly can to impact gene expression and potential through nutrition, age, security, fetal programming, etc., and even high grading and culling the correct bucks as you mentioned, would it be fair to say that when all that is done, that we will only reap the benefit of bucks that end up staying on our own property after being born? If fawn dispersal is accurate and true, only a slimmer of a percentage of buck fawns bred by bucks on our property and then born on our property will actually call our property home. Would we not actually be helping our neighboring properties miles away more than our own in the big picture? Would we not be better off to look at the genetics within a certain mile range of a property, data entry of Pope and Young, Boone and Crockett bucks per county to determine if it's worth trying to influence the deer herd, giving we as hunters can't go out and harvest every doe on our property that has a buck fawn in hopes he stays home before he disperses the next spring and fall? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Well, Chase, the whole age, genetics, nutrition thing, they all fit together. So it's not like you just focus on one and not the other. And as you get into each one, let's just say nutrition, for example. That nutrition is a year-round thing. You're not just going out there and, feeding the deer during hunting season, for example, and then after that, it's over. It's diversity and it's year-round. So, it's constantly changing with the seasons. With genetics, it's not just culling the lower end bucks in each age class before they reach maturity. It's also harvesting the does that have the buck fawns with them, because research has shown that if that doe is still alive, the odds are very, very great that buck fawn is going to disperse and he's not going to be living where he was born. And that's what you're getting into here. So that buck fawn that we put all the effort into, he's going to end up miles away and benefiting someone else. That's why it's so important that this doe management be part of the whole herd management. It's not just managing the buck side. We got to shoot those does that have the buck fawns with them. And those are the bucks that we're going to have the best chance of, keeping on the farm and also having better antler genetics than the average, so to speak, wild buck in that area. So there's just a lot of things that come together when you're trying to grow giants. And age, age is one I haven't touched on yet, but once you do everything else, then you got to put age on them. And it really doesn't matter how big they are at a young age. We got to have the willpower to let those bucks get to older age. And I know there's going to be people saying, well, you didn't do that with Mel. Well, yeah, you tell me how many people are going to pass up a 220-inch buck at 4 years old. He was over 200 at 3 years old, and I did pass him. And a lot of people say he wasn't 3, but I know darn good and well he was. I got to shed antlers. I got at least one when he was a yearling, one when he was a 2-year-old, both when he was 3. There's no doubt that yearling antler was from a yearling buck, as well as all the pictures and video footage I got. So he was definitely 3 at 200. I did let him go because I didn't want to look at a 3-year-old buck on my wall the rest of my life and wonder how big he would have got. But at 4 years old, I figured I'd rolled the dice enough and he was going to get shot, and that's what happened. So age plays into it as well. I mean, that is a very, very, very rare buck. I don't expect to ever see another wild buck that big at that young age. Typically, you're looking 5-6 years old anyway to get those true giants. But, all those different factors play into it. And I'm never going to say that one factor is not important. And I think the discussion that we had on social media when I made those posts, people were trying to say that I was, or they got the idea that I was saying age is not important and nutrition is not important. Yeah, they are all important. But without genetics, it's never happening. It can happen without good nutrition. I gave examples. It can happen without age. I just mentioned one right there with Mel. But without genetics, it never, ever happens. And we can go back to the beginning of time. Every record book buck that ever walked this earth had the genes. He may not have had the age. He may not have had the nutrition, but he had the genes.
I'm gonna take this a different way. And I know sometimes when there's a question on this podcast, we kind of go on a little bit of a rant or say something. I want to first say, before I say this, I am not attacking Mr. Chase from Blaine, Tennessee. So don't, people, and Chase, thank you for listening. This is not, I know this isn't where you were going with this question, but I'm going to spin it this way. Be careful about taking an attitude that says, well, I don't want to go through all this work because I'm just helping the neighbor. Or it's not worth, I can't make a difference, so I'm not going to do it. If everybody starts taking that attitude, oh, I'm just going to shoot whatever because the neighbors are going to shoot you. Now you're that neighbor. So I think it's a very detrimental line when you're saying something like, well, these practices or these ideas of management, and come up with some excuse of why they won't help you and then just not try. You know, whether we can put an implementation plan as good as yours on your home farm, probably not. But every single property we go to, we can make better. And we can make the herd better for generations to come if we're doing the right thing. To take a cop-out excuse like, well, I'm not going to do all this because the buck just goes to the neighbor. Well, guess what? The buck that I shot on your property, it wasn't there the whole time. It came back looking for a doe. We've talked about it multiple times. Early season, you know, coming back before the rut, homecoming bucks, and then late season, you can still pull these deer back by knowing you have the best property, the least intrusion throughout the season, no matter if they're there or not. So don't be that neighbor and don't just cop out an excuse. Chase, I'm not talking about you, buddy, but don't just have that excuse. I can't make a difference, so I'm not going to try.
Well, I am convinced that when if you're managing a property the way I think it should be managed, like for year-round nutrition, and in the winter months you're the property in the whole township, neighborhood, whatever, that's got the best food sources, I am convinced that these bucks that winter on your farm as button bucks with their mother and they disperse the next spring to new home ranges miles away, I am convinced that those bucks in a rough winter when they have a hard time finding food, I'm convinced that they remember where they fed as a button buck on a property that had plenty of food and they come back. It's the only explanation I can come up with for the bucks that show up on my farm in the winter that I have zero pictures of, and sometimes zero pictures for forever. All of a sudden, here's a mature buck that shows up. And I surround my farm with cameras, not just, I'm talking a mile, 2 miles radius of my farm. I know where the bucks summer at that winter on my farm. And these bucks are showing up that they came from way farther than that. And I'm convinced it's because they were here as a button buck and they remember where they found food when it was tough going. So, you know, you could do everything right. A buck leaves your farm, disperses, and then boom, 3, 4, 5 years later, we get a really rough winter, and this mystery buck shows up on your farm. There's a good chance he might have been one that was born there.
Yeah. So Chase, again, I wasn't picking on you, buddy, but we get that a lot in the hunting community. It's you know, the woe is me, I can't ever make a difference, I'm not going to try, or just it's another level of just the excuses. If you want to dive in and make a difference, you can. The amount of difference you can make is based on the property and your neighbor. I think that's the variable that everybody has, but don't be that neighbor.
This one comes from Steve Myers from Terre Haute, Indiana. It says, hello to both Don and Terry. Thank you for your continued interesting topics each week. This question is for Don. You said it yourself last week, there is nothing you like more than a good debate, so here we go. With last week's topic, genetics, nutrition, or age, you stated first off that the vast majority of bucks never reach 170 inches. In your support of genetics out-trumping nutrition, You gave the example of 2 fawn bucks being captured, one south of Effingham and the other up near Monticello. In each case, nutrition was subpar, yet both bucks reached 180 to 190 inches in maturity, supporting your genetics theory. It's not that I disagree and this is all in fun, but if I were next to you debating, my response back to you would be the following. If the vast majority of bucks never reach 170 inches, what are the odds that not one but both of the captured buck fawns reached 180 to 190 inches? It really would have made more sense if neither buck made it to 170 inches. Maybe one, but both? I know myself, plus many other listeners, would love to hear your response to this statement. Thanks and God bless. Well, Steve, I know of a handful of other buck fawns that were grabbed in the wild, and I want to state right from the start here, that is illegal. Nobody should be doing that, but it has happened. And these other buck fawns never did amount to much of anything. 140 inch, 150 inch at maturity. The 2 bucks that I mentioned, one South Effingham, the other by Monticello, they did beat the average. And I truly believe that, at least in my part of central Illinois, that the typical average, whatever you want to call it, buck that reaches maturity is never going to reach 170 inches. Most of them are going to top out in 140s, 150s, maybe a few in the 160s. The bucks over 170 are rare. Percentage-wise, they are rare. Yeah, these 2 happened to do it, and they did it on poor nutrition. They did have age. They had age going for them, and they had genetics going for them. The nutrition was what was lacking. Yeah, they beat the odds. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for why they beat the odds. It's just that they happened to be laying in the wrong place when somebody walked along and found them as a fawn and took them home. But
what do you think boy, this is a really hard question to answer. What do you think the average lifespan of a buck is?
2.5.
I was going to say maybe 3, but most bucks do not get to the point they could even ever get there.
Nope.
It's just in different areas are going to be different ways. I think that's part of the reason maybe Iowa is so different, because of how much they limit out-of-state hunters coming in. They got genetics, they got nutrition, and the hunting pressure is nowhere near what it is in other states with multiple bucks being able to be shot. But man, when you really start thinking about areas like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, how many bucks are shot, there's not many that make it to even 3, 4, much less 5.
Well, age is the reason that Iowa has so many big bucks, is because they got more older bucks. Age is the reason Michigan and Pennsylvania don't, because they don't have very many older bucks. Age is very critical.
Right. I agree.
And I've had so many people throw that argument out on the social media posts, but I'm not debating the importance of age.
Right.
But I'm saying it can happen without age, but it can never happen without genetics.
Exactly. That was what we were getting circling back around. So even still, even if you did get the bell curve of all of your age structure, you could still be a bunch of 135 to 150 4 and 5 year olds. So
yep.
All right.
Next one comes from Gerald Raymer from Elkhart, Indiana. It says, do you have any recommendations for food and cover sources in a wet location, or isn't there anything you can do in a wet location with success? Well, there are things you can do in wet locations. You're going to be more limited on food and cover. So, there's a lot of trees that'll grow in wet location. If it's super wet, bald cypress will grow there, even in more northern regions. If it is somewhat wet or seasonably wet, there's a lot of oak species: bur oak, pin oak, swamp white oak. Those will all do good in bottomland settings, even places that flood. They'll survive there with no problem whatsoever. And then you can get into the shrubs. You got the red osier dogwood, and again, it depends on how wet. elderberry does pretty well in bottomland setting. Silky dogwood will do good. So, yeah, there's ways to provide cover in a wetter setting. Food, you're way more limited. Now, of all the fruit trees that we ever promote through our consulting, the apples, pears, chestnuts, persimmons. Persimmons is one that'll do pretty good in a wetter area. You don't want to plant apples. You don't want to plant chestnuts. Neither one of those are going to do good in a wet area. In fact, the chestnuts will probably never survive, but they like a drier site. They like a more alkaline soil, lower pH. And I think, that's one of the things that I run into a lot on consulting. You'll see a guy, he's planted a tree or some fruit mass-bearing trees in the wrong location for that species. So, you don't want to have apples down in a frost pocket. So if they're down low, they're way more susceptible to frost, which will freeze those blooms in the spring. You get a late spring frost, and boom, you lose your entire apple crop for that year. But back to the question, persimmons is one that'll do fine in a wetter setting and can withstand some flooding. So that's really the only food source I can think of. And again, it depends on how wet. Clover can do fairly well in a damper setting. Alfalfa, on the other hand, you want that in a drier upland site. So it just depends on how wet, how much sunlight, and I just encourage you to experiment until you find something that does good.
As far as bedding grasses, switchgrass will do better. Indian grass and big blue stem will not.
Exactly. Switchgrass can depending on the variety, the real world switchgrass, which is the best out there, will absolutely do fine in a bottom. I know of a planting of it in a river bottom that I've seen in 6 feet of water. The water goes down, the stuff comes right back, and it's been there for probably pushing 20 years now, and that river's been out of its banks many times and flooded that field, and yet that real world switchgrass continues to come back.
Well, this one might take a little bit of time. We'll get it up on the screen.
This one comes from Zach Anderson from Bay City, Wisconsin. Says, Dear Don and Terry, love the podcast and been listening since way back in the beginning. My question is, you talk about how you need to have a sanctuary with no human intrusion, but what should the average guy who has a property of 20 acres or less and possibly an irregular chunk of land only allowing one access point to do? I have a bunch of buddies who also bow hunt, and some of them have multiple properties, and most of those are less than 40 acres. I really appreciate your insight on everything you guys talk about, but sometimes I feel most of what is said is for people with big tracts to hunt, and I bet if you took a poll, most people's tracts to hunt are rather small compared to what would be ideal to you. Thanks and good luck this season. Well, Zach, we talked earlier about a video that I made today with my rope scrape, and in that video, you're going to want to watch it because that is a very small property in terms of the cover that's on that property. I was in a wooded draw, and I promise you that wooded draw was less than 5 acres of cover, and I hung the rope scrape there, and I explained, that I'm going to have a camera on that rope scrape, and I will get a picture of every buck that comes through that draw. He's going to hit that rope scrape. He can't help themselves. And I will not hunt that farm unless that camera shows me a shooter buck. And on a small property, human intrusion becomes even more critical. The smaller the property, the more critical it becomes. My suggestion on these smaller properties, and I know people are not going to want to hear this, but if you want to kill the biggest bucks or the best bucks in your area, or even just a good buck, you're going to have to time your hunts for when the odds are in your favor. You can't just go every Saturday and Sunday because you're off for the weekend. You can't just go hunting on that property anyway. Find other places. Hang a rope scrape in there with a camera on it. Make sure you get it in the right spot, and have good access to your stands. Watch the wind direction when you're hunting. Have your setup all in place, and let your camera tell you when to go hunting. Don't go until the target buck is there. And that's the best thing you can do on a small property like that. Otherwise, you're just going to burn it out. It takes so little to burn out a small property, and I think that's what everybody misses. I've got 20 acres to hunt. So every time I go hunting, every chance I got to go hunting, I'm going to go hunt that 20 acres. And you just end up burning it out before it's ever good. And I get that, you guys talk about you've only got small properties, and I'm talking to the guys with bigger tracts of land. You guys got to remember that I started the way you guys are right now. I started with absolutely nothing. Nothing. I didn't own a square inch of land, and everything I hunted was either public land or by permission. Didn't plant food plots until I had my own property. You could go out there and get permission on a farm today, the way the food plot industry has boomed, and you could probably get permission from a farmer to plant some cover crop in one of his fields, and he'd be grateful to have you do it and buy the seed. That's something that the idea didn't even exist back in the day when I was hunting these small properties. The advice I'm sharing with you here, I learned the hard way. I burned out more small properties than I can even remember. And I did it because I hunted day after day after day, and I just kept going back to where I had permission to hunt. And if I would have had today, if I'd have the opportunities that I had 30, 40 years ago, my wall would look so much better than it does. I just didn't know any better, and I was burning out properties right and left. And the advice I'm giving you here is solid advice. Get your setup ready. Get your stands in place. Know how what wind direction you're gonna hunt with. Know how you're gonna access these stands. Then get your camera in there on a rope scrape or some other pinch point or whatever, and just totally stay away until your target buck shows up, and then go hunt.
I can appreciate what Zach says, because every time we talk about TSI or food plots or all this stuff, that is lending itself more to the guys with acreage. But I'll argue that the whole basis, there's a t-shirt on our apparel website, the link's in the description below, free of human intrusion. The overall theme of everything that we preach lends itself more to small properties than it does big ones. So I get it, Zach. A lot of what we talk about with food plots, all of this stuff, TSI, sanctuaries, we get it. But yeah, Don and I both come from hunting small permission properties, 20, 30 acres. So we know exactly. And human intrusion is where it's at before the rest of it. That's the overall theme of what we've preached from the very beginning.
With a small property, guys go in and they try to implement a lot of the things that are promoted on this podcast and everywhere else, really. And that's food plots, habitat projects, fruit trees, whatever. And those projects require human intrusion. There's a balance there. You can do some projects to improve your odds, but you go too far, and it doesn't matter what you do, you go too far and the odds just drop. They just crash. Back clear down below, if you'd have done nothing at all, your odds just crash to basically next to zero. So you got to balance that human intrusion with any improvements that you do.
All right, well, let's put the last question of the week up on the screen, and we'll get her wrapped up.
This one comes from Brett Petty from Muncie, Indiana. It says, "Hi, Don and Terry. I had a question about Don's post on Facebook about deer bedding in his switchgrass. Don's farm is very isolated, and deer don't have a lot of other options for bedding. If your farm was located in an area where the neighboring properties were timber that had TSI work done on them, would your stance on switchgrass change? To me, it makes a lot of sense that you don't want browse in your bedding because you want the deer to get up and work their way to your food plot. But if a deer has the choice of switchgrass with no browse or timber that had both good bedding and browse, wouldn't the majority of the deer choose the timber?" Well, Brett, I think just based on my experience, I think the idea of diversity within your bedding cover is as important as diversity within your food sources. And I say that I think people don't understand how individual these bucks are. And what I've noticed on my farm is that certain individual bucks prefer the switchgrass. Smokey is a prime example. That buck bedded in the switchgrass day after day after day when he had great wooded cover right next to it. Other bucks I'm talking older, mature bucks, almost never bedded in the switchgrass. They preferred the wooded cover. So I think it comes more down not to what's surrounding your property as much as it does the individual buck. And, in some regions, it may be that the majority of the bucks prefer the wooded cover. I'm not going to argue that point. But here is why you want diversity in cover. If you're the only guy in the whole area that's got a switchgrass patch, and one of those bucks like Smokey comes along that loves to bed in the switchgrass, guess what? You're the only guy that's got it. He's going to be bedded on your farm. I think the diversity of cover. Now, I've got many clients that have expected me to come to their farm and put in a switchgrass patch somewhere. And I never, ever recommend, and I've got a good, awesome client in Kentucky that comes to mind. This gentleman wanted to tear out wooded cover and put in switchgrass, and he even did it against my recommendation, I might add. But I don't ever recommend tearing out wooded cover to add switchgrass. But if you've got enough open cover on your farm that you could use more cover, then by all means diversify the bedding cover. Again, if one of those bucks comes along that likes the switchgrass and you've got it, you're going to have that buck, and you can keep him on your farm for way more daylight hours than if you didn't have that diversity. So it comes down to diversity more than they prefer one or the other, and it also comes down to the individual buck.
There's another scenario that I run into in my area, because we have these long wooded, spines or ridges that fall into hollers. And sometimes the way these farms were used for agriculture is that field is completely open. And that back half of that field, if it's on a farm with no access back there, we just got an open field that we can't get to. So, one of the ways that we'll use switchgrass in areas that have timber is just go ahead and make where we can't hunt, from food, make the back half switchgrass and make it extra diversity of bedding, and leave the food up front, pulling them out where we can hunt. So switchgrass can also be used to basically fill gaps in your habitat plan to move bedding in different places around your property to where you have better spots to hunt with better access.
Yeah, and this is going to be one of the topics. I'm not going to share it here on a public forum because I know somebody will run and make a video of it and take all the credit. But when our group of consultants meets here in June, switchgrass and some of the new ways that I've come up with to use switchgrass is going to be discussed at length that day, because I think there's some real opportunities in certain situations to create some fantastic bedding cover.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that's the end of the show for this week. We have Devin Hurley that's going to have our Sunday night prayer time at the end of this. Keep in mind, we're going to start the Chasing Assurance podcast with my dad around Father's Day this year. And make sure that if you're a real world dealer, you're marking that calendar for the dealer event this summer, because we're also going to do a lot of training on Green Prairie stuff of different products you're going to have access to for your local communities. The biggest challenge we have with our business at Real World is shipping costs. So the more that we empower and try to help our local dealers grow their business and their communities, the better off all of us are. So make sure that you lock that calendar up for that week and head to Arthur, Illinois to come see us.
That's all I have. How about you, Terry?
That's it.
God bless everybody. See you next week.
Chasing Giants has been brought to you by Osseo Camo. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode of Chasing Giants.
Hey Chasing Giants fans, hope you guys are all doing well. It's good to be back with you again on our Sunday night prayer time. I'm Devin Hurley, if you don't know. But I want to come to you with a short passage here in Mark chapter 7, where Jesus teaches a very, very crucial lesson to the Pharisees and the scribes here, who unfortunately did not pick up on the lesson in their time but you and I need to adhere to in our time today. And the lesson is very simple, and as soon as I read through the text and get through a couple verses, you're going to know exactly what I'm getting at here. But it's very crucial for us to really think about here in our day in life today as believers. But let me just read through the text here real quick, and then we'll kind of quickly discuss it. In Mark chapter 7, just to sort of set the scene here, and you'll find this also in Matthew chapter 15. Jesus is in the northwest region of Galilee. He has just walked on water, where he did that great sign before his disciples, and he walked out on the water. And even just before that, he had just fed the 5,000. And so, word is really circulating around in the community who this Jesus character is and what he is about and what he is preaching. And it has the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders of Israel really on their toes a little bit and feeling very uncomfortable. And we find another scene here in the Gospels where Jesus really calls out the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious elitists for how they lived and the life that they were living and the hypocrisy in which they lived in. And there's a very stark warning here for you and I as well that I want us to see. But let me just read through the text and you'll see what I'm talking about. In Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 1, it says this: Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and other things. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? And he answered and said to them, Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as the doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. And then he goes on to verse 9 all the way down into verse 23, sort of explaining this and laying it out in a little more detail. But the gist of what we need to look at here is in verse 6 and verse 7. And Jesus in these two verses quotes from Isaiah chapter 29 verse 13, where it says, These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Now the issue at hand here is actually worship. You'll notice in verse 7 it says, In vain they worship me. Now we all know what that term vain means. It means empty or really hypocrisy or pointless or lifeless or useless really. That's what vain means. This is what really sort of characterized the people of Israel in Jesus' day. They were hypocritical people. If you know anything about the scriptures, you know that what the Pharisees tended to do is that they would take the scriptures and twist it and create sort of their own sort of tradition. They would place more burdens on the people than what the law of God ever meant to do. And the Lord became very angry at this when he came during his 33 years, and especially during his 3-year ministry. And what angered him about this is that as much as they were zealous in their worship, meaning the way that they live, because that's really what worship is. Worship is a way of life. When we think about us as believers, as Christians, our worship isn't just on Sunday mornings. It's not just singing in the car to a Christian song. It's not just reading scripture or in ministering or whatever it may be. Those are certainly huge aspects of our worship. But worship for us as believers is a way of life. It is everyday living. Everything that we say, everything that we do is to the honor and to the praise and to the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. So if you think about it, our whole life is worship. It is worshiping our Lord and giving Him the glory for who He is. And that comes from a pure heart. And I want to talk about that here in just a second. But that was the thing that the Pharisees and the scribes lacked, is they lacked a pure heart. Again, notice in verse 6, it says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And basically what the Lord was saying is you kind of say all the right things, you kind of say all the right things in terms of reading the scripture or what you teach, those kind of things, although they place more burdens on that, and he gets to that. But their heart was far from Him. It was all done sort of mechanically, without thought, without honesty, without purity. And really where that comes from is a lack of love for the Lord. Because that's what a pure heart is. A pure heart comes from a love for the Lord Jesus Christ. And the lesson that you and I can learn here is this, is that we as Christians can get caught up in, of course, the busyness of life. We can get caught up in our jobs. We can get caught up in even our families. We can get caught up in hobbies. We can get caught up in really all sorts of things and forget that our life was meant to be one of worship to the Lord. And they lacked a pure heart, and we can do the same. If you were to go back to Isaiah chapter 1, actually, this really sort of lays it out pretty clearly. In Isaiah chapter 1, we could start in verse 11. The Lord is angry with the Israelites, and He says to them here, He says in verse 11, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or the lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courts?" He says in verse 13, "Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me." And you got to think this all goes back to the way that God prescribed Old Testament worship. He says the new moons, the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. He says, "I cannot endure iniquity in the sacred meeting." He says, "Your new moons and your appointed feast, my soul hates. They are trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hand, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood." And then he goes on in verse 16, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil." And then he says this in verse 17, "Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow." And then he says in verse 18, "Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord." What he's really saying here in Isaiah is that, you come to me with this heartless worship. You come to me with really thoughtless actions because there's no love for me in it. And it is all senseless, it's all pointless, and the Lord doesn't like that. We can learn from this because we're guilty of this as well. How often, if we were to just take our Sunday morning worship, we get to church and we think about all the things we got going on that day, and we sort of just go through the motions. We don't just do that on Sunday morning. We are at times guilty of doing that every day. We just sort of go through the motions of our Christian life, and it is all done really heartlessly. And the Lord gives a warning to the Pharisees and to the scribes here that your lack of purity, your lack of pure heart, your lack of love for me shows your vain worship. This is a big deal. This is a big deal for you. This is a big deal for me as brothers and sisters, as Christians in the faith. Our hearts are to be directed and centered towards God at all times. And how we live our life really is a reflection on how much we truly love the Lord. We know what Deuteronomy says, that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our strength. And if we truly do that, our life will be a manifestation of that in everything that we do, everything that we say, and we won't be like the hypocrites that the Pharisees and scribes are. You know, if you're going to walk the walk, you better talk the talk, right? Or vice versa. If you're going to say one thing, you better be able to do it. The Pharisees and scribes, they failed in that a lot. I pray that that is not the case for you and I as believers. But we are guilty of that sometimes as Christians, where we sort of say one thing and sometimes we live another. And that's very hypocritical of us. And so what I want us to gather from this morning from this evening is that the Lord calls for a pure heart from his people. A pure heart. A heart full of love for him first. That's the first and greatest commandment. And then a heart that is full of love for other people. And that's the second. And if that is the case, if we love God and we love our neighbor as ourselves, we will reflect and we will live a life of true worship. And so I want us to think about that here this evening. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Father, I thank you for our time together here this evening. And Lord, I pray that we'd really think about this, that we would think about how we live our life every day, that our life is really a reflection of our worship and our love to you. Everything that we say, everything that we do, everything that we think, Lord, is all a direct manifestation and sort of the life that we're living. And Father, I pray that as Christians, we would give you not only honor and glory, but Lord, our hearts would be turned towards you with love, a true love, Lord. Because Lord, we know that out of that love comes all the proverb says, springs all of the things of life, Lord. So we just ask that you just give us the grace that we need, that everything that we say and do would give you honor and glory, that we'd live a life of holiness and obedience to you, and that we would have a pure love for you. We pray all these things in your most holy and precious name. Amen.